Today we're going to continue talking about the civil rights movement, although today is not entirely positive except for towards the very end. So there's a lot of vocabulary words again for this, a lot of key people. All of these we're going to talk about. So let's go ahead and have you go ahead and start writing your notes. Remember, you can continue writing as I begin explaining. Where this really kind of begins is actually at a low level. So you had in the 50s, you had a few of these successful boycotts showing that things can change using nonviolent protests. In the 60s, this methodology moves into the student sector. So you had around, particularly in the South, you had a lot of organizations that began on college campuses, predominantly HBCUs. So if it was a major southern city with a HBCU in it, there was a protest organization. And they used various different methods to protest segregation and denial of civil rights in various different ways. So one of the more important methods that they used were sit-ins. And this was used in a wide variety of areas. The most famous were used at lunch counters, where these, just diners where people would go in to have lunch. And the old practice was African Americans would have to sit in the back or sit outside in the rear of the building. They were not allowed to eat in the main lunch area. So these student organizations would go into these diners, sit down, and wait to be served. Wait for a waiter or a waitress to come up and take their order. And of course, the restaurants themselves, because they didn't want to violate whatever they thought in the South would be a Jim Crow law, and the other regions of the United States might have been like they didn't want to be seen serving African Americans and drive away certain customers. It was this standoff. And typically the students would be arrested for just sitting there. And the whole point is to show how ridiculous these practices and these laws were. And again, you had all over the South, most famous, or one of the more famous ones from here in New Orleans that did the sit-in protest was Aretha Castle Haley. And these organizations did other things to try and integrate other public spaces. So we talk about read-ins here, where they would go into libraries, just sit down and start reading. But most of the time they would be arrested because it was against some antiquated law separating the races. Wade-ins were performed at swimming areas. So this would have been public pools in cities and large towns. Beaches, lakes, places like that. That's how segregated areas around the country were. Then the next step was taking it a little further, and then you have what's called the Freedom Rides, and this was a series of protests. It wasn't just one, it was several different protests in which they were protesting segregation of interstate busing. And so this is when you see like a Greyhound bus or a mega bus, and back then it would be either that African Americans would have to sit in the back, or if there wasn't enough space for the white travelers, African Americans would have to give up their seats and wait for another bus. So groups of protesters, not just students from HBCUs, but students or liberal students from around the country, would get on these buses in the north and ride south. Now, any of the African American protesters, once they were in the South, they could be arrested for traveling on these buses if they weren't giving up their seat, or they were on what was supposed to be an all-white bus. It got so heated that one of these freedom rides, the bus was actually bombed in Alabama while it was staying over. So the president at the time, President Kennedy, has to step in because the interstates are under federal jurisdiction. And he wants to protect the protesters, but the only way that he can do it without alienating certain voters and things like that is to arrest the protesters. So he has the protesters arrested, but then escorts them to safety because he doesn't want to find out what's going to happen between Alabama and where the bus line ended in New Orleans. So it's an unfortunate way of solving that particular issue. Eventually it leads to the federal government passing legislation that's going to end that level of discrimination. And then you have individuals challenge large organizations, and like James Meredith, who sued the University of Mississippi, or Ole Miss, depending on how you call it, for discrimination in their admissions. And his lawyer in the case was Medgar Evers, and they successfully beat Ole Miss. And so James Meredith was the first student to integrate a public university in the South. Evers, his lawyer, would later, in the next year or so, go on, start organizing voting drives for African Americans, organizing individual protests in small towns and areas all throughout Mississippi. And unfortunately, he becomes one of the first political assassinations in the civil rights movement because of his activity. All right, moving on. All right, last slide here, and we are first going to start with Martin Luther King Jr. So we mentioned it yesterday about his letter from Birmingham jail. So the context of that is he was leading a protest in Birmingham, Alabama, and he's arrested and he's put in jail. In his time in jail, he decides to reflect on his experience and the goals that he sees for the civil rights movement, and he summarizes them in this open letter. An open letter is addressed to everyone. And so this runs in a bunch of papers and a bunch of magazines. It's circulated around. And this is what propels Martin Luther King to becoming the voice of the civil rights movement. He was part of an organization known as the SCLC, where you had a lot of ministers and other activists who were working together for this. And so before really 1963, you had different people who were speaking from different ends of the civil rights movement. That letter from Birmingham jail and then his speech at the Marshall in Washington is really what makes Martin Luther King what we think of him today as the singular voice of that time. And eventually we'll talk about some other voices, but it's sort of his ascendancy to that leadership role. And so in the March on Washington, thousands of protesters gather in Washington, D.C., and they march towards the Lincoln Memorial, where they have a stage set up and a bunch of people are going to give speeches, such as Martin Luther King Jr. doing his I Have a Dream speech. You also had people who worked with Martin Luther King, John Lewis, who would go on to be a long-serving member of Congress, fighting and continuing to fighting for civil rights, and people like A. Philip Randolph, who had planned the original March on Washington in order to get President Roosevelt and President Truman to start integrating some of the federal organizations like the military. And so they were all there in this sort of culmination. So the March on Washington is not this singular event that happens overnight. It was a long planned event with a lot of very important people who were involved with it. And it culminates in 1963, but it started back in the 1940s. This idea of if we get a ton of people together and get them to Washington, D.C. and have a nonviolent protest of marches and speeches, it should cause a reaction. So before 1963, just the threat of it at least got presidents to take action, to take executive action. Now they need Congress to take action. And because of that March on Washington, Congress finally decides that they need to pick up where the Supreme Court had left off with Brown versus Board and a few other decisions, and that they actually need to make a law that says it is illegal to discriminate against people based on race in anything that the federal government can oversee. So this is public places, this is in job discrimination, and admissions to universities, things like that. So, and that's what's important about the Civil Rights Act of 1964, is that it finally gave the federal government the ability to prosecute people who were, or organizations who were clearly denying rights to people of color. And just to keep it in context, because we talked about it in the previous lesson too, there have been several civil rights acts. That's why the years are very important. We talked yesterday about the Civil Rights Act in 1957. There was a Civil Rights Act passed back in the late 1860s to reinforce the 14th and 15th Amendments. So you just always want to make sure that you're keeping that straight in your head. And that is where we are going to stop today.